Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Recover Your Life podcast. My name is Bridgett, and I'll be your host. Together, we're building a community of men and women who know what it means to grieve well, rest well, and love well to live the life we dream of. On today's episode, I share a conversation with my new friend, Barb Hill, all about what does it mean to be a man or a woman who waits well. This conversation is for all of us. It's for me, it's for you. When we find ourselves in seasons of waiting, whether those seasons feel filled with hope or crumbling in disappointment, I hope that this conversation encourages you to wait well and know you are so worthy of love and grace in the waiting. Barb is an author and licensed mental health therapist who is passionate about supporting others in both their navigation of faith and mental health. In 2019, Barb founded Holding Space Counseling, a thriving group practice in Brentwood, Tennessee, where she works as a trauma therapist as well as supervises other therapists in their clinical work. Barb calls Tennessee home, and she lives in Nashville, Tennessee with her pup, Nash. So excited for you to hear today's conversation. Let's dive in. Barb, thank you so much for joining us today on the Recover Your Life podcast. Glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we connected recently through our mutual friend, Courtney Leo, who we love around here, and just knew that you were carrying something and just had something to share with the world that I really connected with. You know, around here, we talk about being men and women who grieve well, rest well, and love well. And a part of living in wholeness and wellness also means navigating seasons of waiting well at the same time. And so it's something that all of us have experienced in our stories. For some of us, it's been an incredibly painful season or seasons, decades of our life. For other of us, maybe we're kind of in a spot that says, hey, like I feel a lot of hope and a lot of peace around waiting. But either way, I think that we all can relate to this topic of waiting. And so I cannot wait to dive into this conversation with you today. But before we jump in, I would love for you to share with the listeners a little bit about who you are and what's been mattering to you lately.
Hmm. Who am I? Gosh, where do I begin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of my career and profession, so I'm a mental health therapist and I'm based here in Nashville, Tennessee. And recently was given the amazing opportunity to write and publish Seasons of Waiting, which I know we'll be talking more about. And what has been mattering to me lately? Um, I'm a big fan of rhythms. I'm not so much a routine person as much as I'm a rhythm person.
Yeah, that's great.
And morning rhythms are especially important to me for a lot of reasons. But I think because of my job, it feels very important to really orient myself to the things that matter most to me so that I
Yeah.
can really be present with people and listen to their stories and be available to help in whatever way is needed at the time. But that really isn't so possible if I don't really stay consistent with those rhythms. So
Mm-hmm.
morning time's important, just to get quiet and be still and drink my coffee and journal
Mm-hmm.
and listen and pray and all of the things that really help to, in a lot of ways, locate myself. I
That's
think
good.
as an Enneagram too, I can be so others focused
Yeah.
and very self-forgetting. And so
Mm-hmm.
that rhythm in particular helps me to locate myself
Mm-hmm.
so that I can locate others well. So I would say that, especially going into a new year, what normally always matters, but maybe even matters more, is just that rhythm of being still in the morning.
That's so beautiful. I've been listening to Emily P. Freeman's The Next Right Thing podcast. And one
Mm,
of the things that she does each season is I listened to it this morning of things that are saving her life.
mm,
And so she has a list of like, this show on Netflix is saving my life. It's a great opportunity for me to connect with my children. Or this walking pad. She talked about, her walking pad that she walks on, or just like different things, this nail polish. Like it can literally be anything. And so I love that idea of, even using that language of locating me, what's important to me, what matters to me, because it does help us orient to the world of, okay, cool, especially in a helping profession, right? Of saying, hey, you matter so much to me, but I can't help you if I'm not present with who I am first.
exactly. Yeah.
That's
Well
it.
said.
That's so fun. And so you did mention that you were able to publish Seasons of Waiting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I'm so excited. Can you talk a little bit about, of all the things that you could write about, what made waiting the thing for you?
Hmm. I mean, firstly, it's been a deeply personal experience, as
Mhm.
is the case for many of us. But what I noticed through the years is that waiting was one of the main avenues, so to speak, that God was using to do some really deep work in my life, sustained seasons of waiting. Because I
Mm,
think like those shorter duration of waiting experiences, like we can move through them. Not to say, not to invalidate like the
yep.
difficulty of them at all, but I think it's that sustained experience of waiting that really challenges us
Mhm.
um, and refines us. And so recognizing how challenging and transformative
Yeah.
waiting has been in my own life, and just how much God has imparted to me through all of those different iterations of my waiting seasons. And at some point, recognizing that what God was giving me was not just for me, that it was
Mhm.
meant to be shared. And then it was just a matter of turning towards what that would look like, of how
Mm,
would I even go about
yeah.
sharing this, and what form would that take, and so on. So I would say it first started with just the personal experience of waiting. What actually my writing consultant said to me a while ago, to write what I know, to write
Mm,
what I've lived.
yeah.
And I think waiting is something that I know well, and
Yeah.
I've lived and continue to live
Mhm.
um, as well as humanly possible. So
Mhm.
that was kind of like the catalyst, or maybe like the birthplace of wanting to write a book about waiting.
That's so beautiful. So, your book is set up kind of parallel to our natural seasons. Can you talk a little bit about the parallel between natural seasons and seasons of waiting?
Yeah. Well, I was even just loving the way that you were introing some of the facets of the book, and
Mhm.
what I was hearing was just the multifaceted experience of waiting. And I
Yeah.
think the seasons, the physical seasons, help to really speak to how
Yeah.
nuanced and multifaceted um, our experiences of waiting are. And that was a big reason why I wanted to talk
Mhm.
about waiting through the physical seasons, to really, just validate the reality that waiting in a winter season feels really different than a fall and
Mhm.
a spring and a summer.
Yeah.
And I think the world around us in that way helps to really tell that story of, what waiting looks and feels like. And it's not this crystallized, static
Mhm.
experience, it's dynamic and it's ever changing, as we are. So that was kind of like the main reason behind wanting the book to follow the physical seasons.
Yeah, that's good. And so I know that you also in this, in this process, like you said, like you presented your story in a way where people can engage in their own story. I know we've talked about this too, but I think sometimes it's really easy when we read a book or read some sort of resource where we can discredit of like, oh, well, my pain's not like their pain, or I'm not waiting on a health diagnosis. I'm waiting for a new job. Theirs is more important. And so we can kind of disqualify our own experience or, elevate our experience to say, okay, well, at least you're not, right? So someone shares something with you, well, at least you're not waiting for this experience or whatever. And so, what does it look like for us, even as you said, like your own personal rhythms of locating ourselves? Um, what does it look like for us to actually validate the fact that waiting can be really hard?
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, what first came up was just how quick all of us are to compare our pain to another,
Hmm.
and create basically like a hierarchy of pain. And
Hmm.
like that there's rungs on the ladder of pain, like I'm one rung down, you're one rung up. And
Hmm.
there's probably a million reasons why we do that. But I think my hope in a lot of what I communicate in the book is to level the playing field, so to speak, and as much as possible remove that comparative piece and that hierarchical piece that we're so quick to create, and lay this foundation of waiting is hard, no matter what your particular waiting story or experience is or has been. That all of us can connect with the feelings that come up when we're waiting. So whether you're waiting to conceive and have a baby, or waiting to get married, or waiting for a healing in your body, or for a financial breakthrough, whatever form you're waiting is taking, that the feelings of disappointment and grief and anger and frustration, like the emotional experience is really the common thread for all of us. And so to lay that foundation and say, hey, like, we're not doing ourselves or anybody a service by comparing our pain to each other. How about we pivot and actually just validate that waiting in general, no matter what form it's taking, is hard.
Oh, yeah. I think for me, one of the things that I love and hate about waiting is like the character refining process of there's actually something that changes, and it's been, depending on the situation, but like there's actually something really beautiful that happens inside of me and that happens inside of us when we're presented with a dream or a desire that doesn't just happen automatically. And I don't present that in a way of some yucky theology of like, God's going to make us prove how much we love him, like not that kind of thing. But I do think that there's a like the willingness to stick it out. I think about, I'm totally blanking on where it is right now in scripture. I'll have to figure it out and put it in show notes later. But it's in James, right? Like trials produce perseverance, and all, continues. And the last part of that passage says, and proven character leads us back to hope, because this hope is not a disappointing fantasy. In the Passion Translation, it uses that language. And I love that, because I think when we're talking specifically about waiting, it's really easy just to be, I've always thought, like, why isn't it just love that like leads us back to hope, right? Like, yay, love, this is a good thing. Like, I'm desiring this new upgrade in my life, whatever it is. I'm desiring this good thing. Like, that should just be enough to like fill me with an IV of hope to keep going. But there is this character development process, which goes like, am I the man that I say I want to be? Am I the woman that I say I want to be? Regardless of what happens. And that is a very like beautifully gutting process, but it does feel that way sometimes, of like, ooh, wow, everything that I've hung my hope on, that was in a quick, fast pace achievement of my dreams, like that's not really holding me anymore. And so what do we do? I think specifically I'm thinking about like, as people are in, from the age range that's coming to mind is like 30s. It's like, okay, we're in real adulthood now, right? It's not like post-college just figuring out, we're in adulthood. We've navigated this, most likely this transition of what I believe about God may be different than what I had growing up. What I believe about myself is different than maybe what I've carried. At this point, we've probably faced some really heavy seasons of heartbreak that kind of reorient of like, is this the life I want? Is this a person I want to be? When we're kind of approaching waiting, kind of in that season of, okay, cool, like I've lived some life now, and I'm just not quite sure where to put my feet to even begin, of like, is this even worth waiting for? Right? How do we hold our hearts in those types of seasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's part of the dynamic experience of waiting, is that it's interacting with who we are. So when we're 18, 19, 24, 25 versus moving towards midlife, and there's somewhat of an establishment of our identity and who we are and what we really want, we're going to experience waiting differently. And, I'm imagining for many that in our 30s, a lot of the big events in life are happening, or we really want them to happen. And if those big events are not happening within the time constraints that we imagined, it can bring deep confusion and frustration and panic and fear and all of the things.
Yeah.
So that's one way that I can see us interacting uniquely in those like 30s age range, interacting with waiting uniquely, because there's probably some deep desires that we're hoping to be fulfilled during that time in our lives. And back to your point around the character development, I think that's the invitation, is that, if those things aren't happening within the time frame we hoped for, there is that invitation to turn inward and to allow that process that you've been invited into, whether you wanted to or not. There's an invitation for like a refining and a development of character. And it's not an either or. It's not like there's an invitation for character development and there's a discarding of the desires of your heart. Like I hold both of those together. And that God cares a lot about what you care about. And he also cares about that development of your identity and who you are. And to learn yet again in your 30s to trust God, probably in a different way than when you were younger.
Yeah. As you're talking, it's kind of reminding me of a lot of the tension that I feel of, especially around like understanding. You use this phrase of spiritual autonomy. So autonomy, is the decision, is the belief that I get to decide who, how, and when, right? I interact in the world around me. And I think, for me in the faith space, it's kind of been this wrestle of like, no, like I want to live a life that's bigger than me, and I want to live in partnership with God. And so it's this, kind of holding the both of, yes, technically it's beyond my control of why I'm in the season of waiting that I'm here, right? So for me, I'll just take mine personally, right? Like for me, waiting for marriage, right? Like that is a desire and dream that I have. And yet at the same point, if I wanted to go find someone to marry me today, I could go do that. Now that is, that's actually not the dream that I want. Like the dream isn't even a piece of paper or a ceremony. The idea is a lifelong partner to build a life with. And so how do we kind of hold both of the, like, because I guess I've seen it in my story kind of go one of two ways. Like sometimes I feel really powerless of like, I have to, like, there's nothing I can do to make this come to fruition. Like, it has to be God. It's God's timing. It's God's way. And then the other side of like, but I don't want to live powerless in my connection with God. And there are things, obviously, like, it's the funny thing of like not waiting for the mailman to show up at your door. Like maybe there are stories where, you marry them, but kind of in that space of how do we hold both this idea that like God is God and I am not. And so there's a part of this mystery that has a divine component to it that is beautiful and wonderful and also very deeply annoying. and this like, no, I'm actually really powerful in my life and I'm choosing to wait. Like how do we hold both of those dynamics as true?
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is when we're waiting, we will find ourselves pendulating between passivity and striving. So if we're in a moment of feeling powerless, then we might find ourselves slipping into passivity of, there's really nothing for me to do, kind of resigning ourselves to our circumstances, or we might swing to the other extreme and start spinning our wheels and striving and feeling really anxious and trying to manufacture something. And so knowing that is a part of the human experience when we're waiting for something that's important to us. Kind of going back to your point about spiritual autonomy, I think when we have like a control centered perspective, then we're going to find ourselves pendulating between that passivity, powerlessness, striving, and
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. But if we can shift our mindsets and really our hearts from a control centered place to an agency centered place,
Mm.
that agency still provides that autonomy and that empowerment of like,
Yeah.
I'm not victim to my circumstances. Because honestly, I think that's one of the most painful parts about waiting is we feel
Yeah.
like we're at the mercy of something outside of us. Like we don't have agency or autonomy or any sort of sense of power in and among our circumstances. And so to shift our minds from trying to control to discovering what we actually have agency over. Like we have
Mm-hmm.
agency over how we think, how we interpret, what we believe, how we respond, the places we go, the people that we are in community with, the prayers that we pray. There's actually so many things we have agency over that has absolutely nothing to do with control.
Yeah.
And so that was a big, big, big lesson for me is to shift from a control centered place to an agency centered place
Mm.
so that it could get me out of that really vicious cycle of feeling powerless and then feeling super anxious. That
Yeah.
was just such a trap for me. So I would say, and kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but I would say if we can shift from control to agency and really start to take inventory of what we have agency over,
Yeah.
we'll feel a whole lot better.
Can you give a definition, like a rough definition for what those two words mean in this context, control and agency?
hmm I mean, control is a preoccupation with external factors. Like we want to
Mm.
control the things outside of us
Wow.
to bring a sense of peace and calm and fulfillment. I mean, fill in the blank. So it's this kind of like, if I can control this, then I can manage this.
Mm.
Um, but
Yeah.
agency is actually switching directions.
That's good.
It's actually directing our attention and our energy inward. That I'm not going to try to control X, Y, or Z person or X, Y, Z circumstance to manage my fear. I'm actually going to go directly to the fear. I'm going to turn towards the fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to identify, develop what I would call internal resources. Like, what are the resources on the inside of me that I can
Mm-hmm.
access to bring a sense of calm and peace and perspective?
Yeah, that's so beautiful. One of the things I've loved on your social media page is you said waiting is full of mystery and it will feel unbearable if we approach it with an obsession for certainty. Um,
Mm,
and I think about, that does feel that very obsessive, like, because I'll spiral on weird stuff, right? That control of like, let me get safe, of like, let me answer 500 emails. Like I always joke and say, like, I need to make sure that I have a Sharpie marker available to me 2037 at 2:15 p.m. Right? It's like just something really obscure that's like, how much control can I get um, to feel that, right? So as we're switching to understanding that we may not get answers when we're waiting, right? What is that heart shift process to go, even if I don't get answers, I'm still going to be okay?
mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, it's really hard
Mm-hmm.
because we love certainty as
Yeah.
people. It makes us feel really safe and secure. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever we're encountering uncertainty, it feels very destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I would say similar. It kind of jumps off what we were just talking about, moving from control to agency. Um, to start to identify the things that you are sure of.
Yeah.
Because if we're fixing our attention on the things that are uncertain and we're unsure of,
Mm-hmm.
then it is going to produce a lot of fear and anxiety for us. So I think part of that shift, that heart shift, is let me take inventory. And this might be a daily practice of like, today I'm going to take inventory over all of the small and big things that I'm actually certain of and I'm
Mm-hmm.
actually sure of. And that could extend into like really simple stuff like today I know that I can make myself breakfast and I
Mm-hmm.
can drink a cup of coffee. Today I'm sure about something relationally, like between you and another person, between you
Yeah.
and God. Like to rehearse the things that you actually have certainty around, and that can help calm a lot of the chatter that's probably happening internally.
Yeah. I think that, you know, depending on I'm going to say the intensity, right? Because I don't want to I don't want to compare it, but I also acknowledge that like there are certain things that the intensity of the weight, um, right? There's a different weight to the weight, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so, can I would love to just for us to kind of talk about the difference, right? Even as you talk about um, the natural seasons of how do we identify for ourselves too, like because I think sometimes we can even um, judge or dismiss the depth of pain that we're actually in, because sometimes I know for me even as I'm working with people, it's kind of like, ooh, hey, like if I touch that box and I'm actually tell you how much fear I have, how much disappointment I have fear that if I open that box, I'm never going to be able to see the end of it. It's just going to like consume my life. And so sometimes it feels easier to kind of just, take all the hope, take all the dreams, all the desires, and put it in a box and shove it away because that feels easier. Than doing the brave work to actually say, this is really hard and I'm not 100% certain of what's happening. How do we kind of self evaluate where we're at in our waiting process?
mm-hmm. I think this is one of the things that I love about the topic of waiting, is because waiting feels like a portal to so many other parts of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Because the two things that came up is, that process is going to be unique to each person based on
Yeah.
a couple things. There's many others we could talk about, but if your audience is familiar with attachment styles,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's one part of the book where I tell a personal story, and then one of the mini devotionals later on in that week talks about how we're going to interact with that struggle
Yeah.
differently based on actually our attachment style.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of even our attachment style to God, we
Yeah.
might have an attachment style to the people in our lives that, one way, but our attachment style to God may be the same or it might be different. But
Mm.
like how we wrestle through the discomfort
Yeah.
and the emotions that are present there, it interacts with our way of attaching or not attaching
Mm-hmm.
to God and to ourselves. And then the second thing is our relationship to our emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's informed by so many things. But, if we maybe grew up in an environment that villainized emotions,
Mm-hmm.
saw it as like an impediment or an inconvenience, something that slows us down or gets in the way,
Yeah.
then we're going to interact with emotions based on that association or that
Mm-hmm.
belief that we hold about emotions. So I think that's the hard part about being a therapist, is I can see the complexity
Yeah.
of all of this. It's in some ways it's not super straightforward. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's a some pieces here to evaluate and look at, of like, okay, like I wonder, part of maybe what makes it really difficult to interact with the weight and difficulty and struggle of waiting. Maybe it has something to do with my attachment style. Maybe it
Mm-hmm.
has something to do with my own relationship to emotions and
Yeah.
what I believe about emotions. And so I would just encourage people to really slow down and get curious about those two things in particular.
Yeah.
There's a lot of resources out there about attachment styles and developing a healthy relationship with our emotions.
Yeah, we have 2 episodes previously that people can go back and listen to. We did an episode with Tara Riggs all about attachment styles, and then we did an episode with Dr. Glenn and Phyllis Hill about connecting to our emotions. So I
Mm-hmm.
always think, we can kind of group them in categories of, hey, if you're listening to this conversation today needing a little more support, of course, go ahead and you can follow Barb on social media as well, but know that in your show notes you will also have links to those resources if you need a little more support in either of those areas. But
Mm-hmm.
that's so great. I think that I was talking to a small group that I lead last night, and I said, hey, just remember, like, you will never be able to honor for others what you dishonor in your own story. And so if we talk about being people of humility, people that honor other people, pay attention to your judgments, because you only will judge in others what you first judged in yourself. And so, I think about our perspective in, for this comes to mind. I think about, my first experience of watching someone lose their spouse, of kind of just having this innocent slash ignorant, right? Like, okay, it's kind of time to move on now. Like
Mm.
we have to keep living and going. But then again, taking that, right, that judgment against someone else and having that self-reflection to go, okay, hey, like, where have I made a judgment against my own stories of grief that say you don't have any more time now? Like you have to move forward. You're not allowed to be sad anymore, right? Like you have to get it together. And so, I think that there is this process of waiting where we kind of have to address it of like, I mentioned it before of, is this worth waiting for? And so maybe that's kind of my next question for you is like, as we're navigating that question, right, there are certain things um, where we go, I'm not ready, right? I think I don't even know how to describe what we'll have to just kind of figure it out together, right? There's the
Mm.
like, okay, now I'm ready to, I guess I got to back up. I'm getting too excited. For me in waiting, my experience has been there are some times where the waiting process actually helps me evaluate if it's something I'm actually wanting to put the work in for, of like, no, like this is something that matters deeply to me. And then there are other things where I go and I say, okay, like I actually needed to hold on to this hope of restoration or this hope of whatever the dream is, but I actually feel really okay saying I'm happy to let this dream morph into something different now. Um, I'm curious, kind of like what that process has been like for you. Of how do you navigate that as you go in your own story of, hey, like this is something, this is a core value. I'm not letting this go. I'm happy. I'm happy to die knowing that I still believed God for this thing. And then what are the things where you go, as you've changed in the process of waiting, where you go, no, I actually have peace to say what happened to me in the waiting was more important than the thing, and I'm ready to let the thing go.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. To just going back in my mind to the beginning of our conversation, like I was saying, there's been so many iterations of my waiting experience. And I think
Mm-hmm.
what you're describing has been part of those different iterations of
Yeah.
um, is learning how to relate to what I've been waiting for differently based
Mm-hmm.
on that iteration. And as much as it's a refining process of our inner world, it's very much a refining process too of
Yep.
what it is that we're waiting for. And it's very clarifying along the way. Like to your point, we'll probably find ourselves in one of two places, like refining or clarifying to the point of like, actually, um, I I feel at peace to surrender
Mm.
this or let go of this desire, or it's clarifying in a different way that you you still feel conviction to believe for that.
Yeah.
Either way, you'll be believing for it differently because you're different because you've undergone this transformation in this process. So I would say for myself, there were many moments where I was asking myself those kinds of questions of
Mm-hmm.
um, is this still something, because for me it's marriage and family as well, and so it's is this still something I'm supposed to be hoping and believing God for?
Yeah.
And every time it's been yes, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the process, since there was always a yes, the challenge for me was, okay, I need to relate to this differently now.
Yeah.
The way I relate to my waiting experience now is radically different than the way I related to it 10 years ago, even five
Yeah.
years ago, a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think you bring up a great point that as you're going through a waiting season, um, there's going to be clarification available for you
Yeah.
around the thing it is that you're hoping for, you've been waiting on. Like, is this still for me?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, or actually, there's peace here to to release it, and maybe it starts to take on a different form.
Yeah.
So I think that's the beautiful part of our waiting seasons, is that they're so unique to us and they're so personal to each individual. And there really is no cookie cutter. There's no formula for this. It really is a personal journey for each person.
Mm-hmm. That's so beautiful. This week, I just had this phrase that came to mind that kind of keeps it, like, I feel it in the back of my head, right? And it's this idea of like, who is your Hebrews 11? And so when we look at scripture, they call it the Faith Hall of Fame. Maybe you've heard it referred to that way, of men and women in our Christian history that their diligence to hope, to wait, to pray, to hold on when things felt really stupid to believe for God. That we say like, hey, because of these people showed up and survived it, like you can too. And that's wonderful, right? But I also have to acknowledge in my own human experiences, sometimes connecting to them feels harder because I don't have a tangible in person experience with mothers and fathers of the faith that I might have with someone in my tangible life. And so I've just been kind to like wrap my mind around like whether they're people that I know in my real story or they're, podcasters or pastors or, some sort of person that I've engaged with their content online. I really do think like I have benefited so much from being, air quote, pastored by people online that maybe I'll never have a real life conversation with. Obviously, it's different than what I'm going to have in my local church context, but to look at stories where I go, okay, cool, like to give myself permission that first of all, I'm allowed to change my mind. I'm allowed to say,
Mhm.
oh, something I actually don't want anymore, or I don't want it like that anymore. And to also give myself permission of like, it doesn't have to look like their story in order for my story to be meaningful. But to kind of borrow that hope to go, nope, like look at this story. Look at this story. They held on for 30, 40 years and they watched the thing that they had been dreaming of come to fruition. So that's been really helpful for me in my own story recently. It's just been like, okay, like where are the places where I can kind of look at when I feel flooded with disappointment of like, oh, it feels like in my story, I keep striking out. It feels like it's not working. Um, and I think kind of the other part with that, right, which I think is why it's helpful to have other people's stories as witnesses to our own dreams and desires, is sometimes in that waiting process we kind of have fear of like, oh, did I miss it? Like
Mhm.
am I waiting so long because I missed it before? What are your thoughts on that when we feel of like, oh no, is the waiting self-inflicted because I could have taken an opportunity earlier in whatever the context of waiting is that would have changed my present day.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Gosh, I have a lot of thoughts on that. For me, I'll just go with what came up top of mind when you said that. For me, part of how I would answer that goes back to believing that God is kind.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really, really common and normal um, sentiment or feeling to worry that we've missed something if we're
Mm.
continuing to wait or struggle in the same area. But what really anchors me is how kind God is. And I think of that verse, I think it's in Psalms, that like God knows our frame and he knows that we're but dust, something to that
Mhm.
effect.
Yeah.
And I think like God knowing the frailties of what it is to be human, um, that there's a kindness in God that he's committed to us
Mm.
seeing it, feeling it,
Yeah.
being confronted by it. Um, and when I say it, I mean the thing it is that we're hoping
Yeah.
for. So I think there's two parts of that for me, at least. That one, when I've been concerned that I've missed something, I go back to God's kindness. Like God is
Mm.
kind,
Yeah.
and he's going to make it apparent for me because he knows my frame. He knows the frailty of what it is to be human,
Mhm.
and he's conscious of that. He's kind towards that. And then secondly, I think there's an element of that control mindset maybe in there of like, if and I don't really know exactly how I would even explain that right now. I'd probably have to flesh it out in my own mind, but there's some flavors of feeling like maybe everything is up to me, or I have
Mm.
to be in control of everything in order for
Yep.
it to happen. So if somebody is feeling that way, I would encourage them to get curious about if there's some elements of control in there, and maybe if so, how they can shift towards that more agency centered mindset.
Yeah, I love that. I think about, as I work with people saying like, hey, the goal isn't that this stops being a pain experience for you. Like that might happen. Like we might get to a place where we've given enough honor to these memories and situations where the level of anxiety or the trigger that you feel may lessen or disappear, but like that can't be the goal, because that's really exhausting to be like my life is perfect when I stop experiencing pain, because that's not our human reality.
Hmm.
And so being able to like know like the goal is that the next time you feel pain, you're kinder to yourself than you were
Hmm.
yesterday. And so it's that same thing of like, God is really kind towards me and towards my story. And at the same point, like I bring that radical compassion towards myself that says, hey, like the next time you're feeling frustrated about waiting, that the next time you doubt that God sees you, instead of bringing that judgment in that says, if you really trusted God, or if you really were a person of faith, or whatever it is, that you would just magically feel good about this journey that's taken way longer than you wanted,
Hmm.
and coming from a new angle that says, hey, like I'm just going to be really kind to me today, that this feels really hard. And again, I'll do the right things, right? I'll check in with my therapist, my coach, my friends, my people that I'm accountable to, that says, hey, like here is um like here's my story. And I think that one of the things that's really cool about waiting in community is the fact that like you don't have to witness your sadness on your own. Like you bring compassionate people around you to provide that compassionate witness that says, no, like you matter, and what you're longing for and believing for matters. And it doesn't just matter to you. I think that's, for me, I've received a ton of identity when I have people that will wait well with me, that says it's not important because it's just important to Bridgett. Like, yes, it is. Like, that is a part of why it's important, but it's important to Bridgett because it matters to Jesus, and it matters to the people that have chosen to live life with me and partner with me. That we all say, like, hey, this is something that really matters to us, and vice versa, right? When I'm walking with other people in their seasons, right? Of even if it's not the same thing, even if I've never walked through that type of waiting specifically, I can still reach out and say, I honor I honor what's happening in your story right now, and I'm here to be a witness to say it matters, and that you're worthy of the thing that you dream of.
Hmm. Yeah, I love the way that you're saying that it not only matters to you, but it matters to the people you're doing life with.
Yeah,
Because I think in the process of it mattering to other people, it's almost like they're carrying just a little bit of the weight
yeah,
of it. You're not the only one that's kind of fanning the flame or carrying the burden, so to speak, that other
hmm,
people are carrying that alongside you, because it matters to them
hmm,
too. Not to the same degree it matters to you, but it matters to them as
yeah.
well. And I think that that's a really beautiful way to say that.
Mm. Yeah. Well, Barb, I have so enjoyed our conversation today. I
Mhm.
know there's lots more to say. And so before we kind of wrap up, I'd love to let our listeners know how they can connect with you if they want to buy the book. Um, how can they do that so that they can continue this conversation to be men and women who are waiting well, and who are having that compassionate honor towards themselves and their stories as
Mm.
they navigate waiting as we do in our lives.
Yeah. Well, if they're interested in purchasing the book, Amazon's probably going to be the easiest place to get that, but you can also purchase it online at Target and Barnes and Nobles and Walmart and all the places.
Fun.
And then Instagram, Barb's Hill. My counseling practice is called Holding Space Counseling, and I'm imagining that some of that information will be in the show notes as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Friends, if you're listening, we would just love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out via email or on social media. Share this with your friends, right? If you're walking through a season of deep waiting, or you're holding hope with friends in your life who are believing for God to show up and be everything He promised us He'd be, we'd love for you to share this episode with them as an encouragement to wait well. And so we'll see you next time on the Recover Your Life podcast.